Great. So thanks so much for everyone being here. Thanks for the introduction, Aoife, and thanks to those joining online. I'm going to stay here. Hopefully, for those online, that'll help for hearing me. So what this is going to be just an overview of some of the research I've done recently and a few of the topics that I'm interested in. And as you can see at the top, three of those topics, and not all of them, of things I'm working on, but three of the main ones are loss and damage, carbon pricing, and civilizational collapse. So I figured I'd start strong and end with the most serious one. So let's start out with some breaking news. And by breaking news, I mean news that's about 10 days old now. So as many of you know, the Conference of Parties recently happened in Egypt. So this is the annual meeting where various kinds of climate experts get together to try to plan policy, to try to coordinate various kinds of action, and so forth. And the COP27, the 27th meeting in Egypt was judged pretty harshly. I think many people thought it did not do well. But I think that this headline from the Financial Times gives a pretty representative view of the response to this, which is the United Nations Climate Summit ends in discord after agreeing help for poor nation, jubilation over setup of loss and damage, support tempered by row over emissions goals. So many of you may have seen comments like this in the news, in which case it's pretty clear what row over emissions goals is. We didn't advance our ambition, but you might be less clear about what loss and damage is. So happily come to my talk, and my talk I'm going to start by discussing what loss and damage is and try to give you a framework for thinking about this highly contested term. Okay, so when we're thinking about climate change, there are various kinds of outcomes, climate impacts, and actions, or pillars of policy, that we think about when we're assigning moral responsibility. And in particular, we think about mitigation, for example, increasing renewable use, decreasing fossil fuel use, adaptation, that is protection of vulnerable systems, like doing things like building walls around the Lee higher to protect from flooding. And this other pillar, this third pillar, we call loss and damage. And this is a much less obvious category. It's much less clear what this means or how it differs from the others. When we're talking about these three in the literature, we sometimes distinguish between whether a policy or an action, what its intention is, what it's trying to do. So Lise, who's a climate legal scholar, says that we might ask, is the goal of a policy to reduce carbon, making it mitigation, that's reducing emissions in the system, or to, for example, protect vulnerable populations, that would be adaptation, that is trying to reduce the amount, the susceptibility to an impact. So for example, if we're thinking about changing some farming practice, maybe the goal would be to reduce emissions, maybe it would be to protect a population, and then the question is, which intention is it? But I want to suggest that, at least philosophically speaking, this is really unsatisfying. This is really unsatisfying because intentions are opaque, they're multifaceted, they might not even be clear to the person whose intentions they are, let alone to third parties, and it's not going to be a very effective way for distinguishing these in a robust manner. Another way, which is closely related but not exactly the same, is we might determine which pillars by looking at the people affected. We might look at their preferences, in particular their risk preferences. So Reinhard Meckler and Thomas Schinko suggested, for example, that maybe losses and damages are the policies that are responding to outcomes which are viewed by the population as intolerable, and those that are tolerable as being either adaptable or mitigable. And then we can add more fine-grained risk categories in there as well. But the basic idea is that we might consider who's acting in their intentions, or we might consider who's affected and their preferences. I want to suggest that both of these are going to be, again, overly subjective, overly indeterminate, and not very conceptually satisfying. They're not giving us a lot of explanatory purchase on what the difference between these categories are. So here's my distinction. So I want you to imagine there is a boulder on top of a ledge. So this boulder is in Utah. As you can see, it's close to the edge of the ledge, but we could imagine it anywhere. We could imagine it up on the ledge, we could imagine it close to the edge, we could even imagine it falling down. So here I want you to think that that boulder represents a climate harm or a climate impact. Obviously, climate change involves a huge amount of harms, but we want you to just take an arbitrary impact and imagine that it's the boulder. And it's threatening some village or community in the ground below. So here are two obvious categories. One is where the boulder is up on the ledge and we're pushing it, meaning adding more emissions, pushing it a little bit forward, but it stays up on the ledge. Then we would call it mitigable, meaning that if there weren't further emissions, if we didn't push it further, it wouldn't actually end up harming the people below. However, at some point, you're going to push it such that it's falling over the ledge, and in that point, if nothing else is done, then that boulder is going to harm the people below. So we can imagine that climate impact as being pushed over the edge into the category where it's going to harm those below. And here again, we can think about two categories. We can imagine that it's falling, and if nothing else is done, it's going to harm the people, but it's far enough away that if we intervened, maybe we put something up to deflect the boulder, or we move the people, or we protected ourselves. Any of those things, it's far enough away that we could still protect ourselves from being harmed. Then it's in the category I'm going to call adaptable. It's an impact that hasn't yet harmed us. In that third category, it's falling, it's in free fall, but now it's too late. It's coming for us, and it's now close enough that we can't move, we can't divert it, and so forth. In that case, we would call it a loss and damage. It hasn't yet occurred, but it is a harm that is in the pipeline that at this point cannot be addressed, either through mitigation, that is reducing emissions, or through adaptation, that is setting up something that will deflect it. Okay, so I think that this simple metaphor is actually really, really powerful. So let me go back into it. What do I need to get this metaphor working? Well, I need a couple of things. I need limits to mitigation, that is the point at which it's no longer mitigable, which is the cliff edge, right, where it starts to be free falling, and limits to adaptation. That's the point at which it's too far gone for us to divert it, to deflect it, to move people, whatever it is that is protecting us. And so those two sets of limits are really important for this metaphor. But once you've got them, it's very clear how we distinguish that impact into being mitigable, adaptable, or a loss and damage. And similarly, if we have a policy or a behavior to address that, whether that policy is mitigation, adaptation, or loss and damage, which is confusingly also what we call the policies as well as the impacts. When we're writing it, we capitalize the policies and we don't capitalize the impacts. Obviously, I can't do that when I'm speaking. So confusingly, that's what we call both the policies and the impacts. So what is important here? Well, what this distinction is supposed to tell you is that first of all, that these categories are different. And second of all, what we would need in order to distinguish between an impact being in these different categories. So what are those limits? Well, in the technical literature, we usually distinguish between hard and soft limits to mitigation and adaptation, where the hard limits are, roughly speaking, the scientific limits. Maybe those are the engineering limits, maybe those are the physical or biological capacities we have at some given point. But we might also fix soft limits, which are some combination of things like social, political, economic abilities. So maybe some things we physically could do them in terms of our engineering, but it would be not cost effective, or it would be politically infeasible, or it would make some political group especially unhappy, and so we won't do it. So what I'm going to say is that my account it can work with any of these sets of limits, but you just need to fix some set of limits. And the other thing is it's going to need limits to mitigation, which is also going to work the same. We don't usually discuss those in climate change, but I think that it's clear we need them in order to be completely robust in this category. The next thing to say is that where these limits apply is temporally contingent. It's going to depend on when we're evaluating things. So, something might be in our engineering capacity at some point and not at another. It might be politically feasible at one point and not another, and so forth. So what does all of this point to? Whether a policy is mitigation or adaptation or L&D, that's the capitals, that's the policies, depends on which limits are applicable and when we're acting or when we're evaluating. So that tells us which impacts those can affect. Okay, so what did I try to do here? What I tried to do is make a distinction that conceptually tells you when something is adaptable, when it is mitigable, and when it's a loss and damage. And now I'm going to draw out some moral implications of this. So in the paper that I'm developing, I have many, many different moral conclusions I draw, but I'll just sort of summarize some of the main claims that I make. So one is that even though it's important that something has just been pushed over a border into beyond our ability to mitigate or beyond our ability to adapt, I want to suggest that the responsibility for doing so is shared amongst all the people that contributed to getting there, not just the one that pushed it over the edge, if that makes sense. So the people who initially contributed to getting it close to the edge also morally matter and bear moral responsibility. I call this proportional responsibility for the obvious reason that when we're talking about all of those various contributors, we should contribute more proportionally to all of their contributions. So the reason for that is that before the action occurs, no one knows if they would have had the bad moral luck to be the one that pushed it into another category. So since no one knows, it's reasonable for all of them to have sort of roughly equal expectation that it would occur, and I think that blameworthiness tracks that, so that they're all roughly as equivalent, as responsible as their contributions are. Okay. The second moral claim that I make, which is quite different, is in that adaptable category. So remember I said that there's these outcomes which haven't yet occurred, but if we intervene to protect ourselves, we could protect ourselves. That is, changing our agricultural practices, building dikes, and so forth. I want to suggest that the historical emitters share responsibility with some people who have what I call climate-independent duties to contribute to those adaptive behaviors. And I'm going to give you two grounds for reasons why we might have that. The first is that we know that some adaptation deficits or adaptation gaps are driven by what Cardona et al. Call skewed development processes. Part of the reason why places are not resilient or robust to climate effects is that they have insufficient general development. And so I would suggest that there are general, what we call global distributive justice reasons to contribute to development and therefore to contribute to these kinds of capacities. Another, what I would call climate independent duty, is that some countries that are vulnerable to certain kinds of climate impacts should protect their citizens for completely climate independent reasons. They should, governments, even when they didn't start a particular threat to their population, have some responsibility to protect their population. So even if we ignore the contribution to climate change, it might be that some governments should protect their citizens from those threats. So I would suggest that both of these are climate independent duties to contribute to adaptation. However, I don't think that loss and damage has this shared duty structure. And the reason is that historical emissions caused the problem to be there in a way that adaptation actors did not. And in particular, failures to adapt would not have the same kind of moral responsibility that failures to mitigate would. But I'm going to keep moving quickly because I realize this is something that's quite subtle. Okay, so this is my first stream of research. It builds on some work that I've done about the ethical issues in loss and damage, and it's work that I'm currently developing and hope to be submitting in the next few months. Okay, so this is a category of loss and damage. So the second set of research that I've worked on have to do with carbon pricing and what we call the social cost of carbon. So this is about the question of how we should set carbon prices. So the first thing is to justify that there should be prices on carbon. And so I want to suggest that it's unfair to cause harms without addressing the price of those harms or the effects of those harms. Economists call these externalities or negative externalities in particular. In particular, in this context, Ireland does have a carbon tax. And that carbon tax means that it's more expensive to fill up your car and so forth. And some of those resources are used to address various kinds of environmental purposes. And you can find that out by looking at the Irish government does talk about this in its budget, what it's going to use additional increases in the carbon prices for. Theoretically speaking, many theorists would say that the optimal carbon tax is the one that would match what we call the social cost of carbon, the cost to society of additional tons of carbon, any sort of marginal additional emissions. So how much is society burdened by that cost of carbon dioxide? In particular, is that cost something that society is going to bear, or is it something that the emitters are going to bear? And so to cut a long story short, the main way that we try to figure out these ideal social costs of carbons is by using integrated assessment models. And here at UCC, Hannah Daly is one of the people working on these kinds of models. So a couple of pieces of research on this. So one thing I've tried to do is explain the morally relevant factors that go into these integrated assessment models. For example, in this chapter, I discuss the various kinds of contributions to these integrated assessment models that are morally important. In other research with colleagues, I've worked on how the social cost of carbon can change depending on different kinds of moral assumptions we might have, and in particular, how it might incorporate things like harms to non-humans, harms to the environment, and not just the sort of very standard ones that we discussed. So we sort of generalize the social cost of carbon to discuss issues of inequality, risk, and population ethics. The next thing to say about this is that we need to remember that carbon pricing is not just a set of costs to the consumer or the people that are buying resources that are emitting, but they're transfers. They're transfers from individuals to the government. And if that's the case, the governmental revenue can be used in various ways. For example, as I mentioned, in Ireland, some of those are used for environmental projects, but we can also use it to offset the regressivity. The other thing that I want to say about carbon prices is that it's really important to remember that we think about carbon taxes as being politically really difficult because people don't like the idea of paying more for their energy, for good reason. But all policies that are trying to make it harder to generate carbon emissions, that are making it easier to go green as opposed to brown, are in some ways going to be making it harder to go brown or easier to go green. So carbon taxes and carbon pricing are just maybe an obvious way of doing it, but all the policies that actually would want to do this in some way, making it less appealing to emit. And the last thing I want to say, and I want to push hard, is this idea that we can use those resources to offset the regressivity, as well as do things like motivate behavioral change. So I've argued this in public in various ways. So I wrote a piece for RTE, for Brainstorm, discussing this in the context of COVID-19. I also discussed this with the philosopher Peter Singer in an op-ed, again in the context of COVID-19, arguing that putting price on carbon in the COVID context is actually the best time to do it, maybe counterintuitively. Because newspaper articles are not sort of academically the most respectable thing, I also turned that into a journal article. So this is for the journal Climate Policy, making many of the same sort of points, arguing again that carbon pricing is especially appropriate in the COVID-19 context. But that last point I made about regressivity, I think, is especially important. And one of the things that I came across as I was sort of giving versions of these arguments is that when I would say that, people might sort of nod and say, okay, you could use those resources to offset the regressivity. But they didn't really get it until I started giving examples. So I want to give you a short, very, very simple example. Okay, so suppose you're much richer than I am and you spend 10,000 euros a month. Huge amount of money, right? And I'm much poorer and I spend only 1,000 euros a month. These are not supposed to be realistic numbers. They're just supposed to be nice round numbers that are easy to count, right? Okay, now suppose, or let's grant, that a carbon tax is regressive, meaning that proportionally speaking, it would hit me harder than you. Why? Because I pay less, maybe more of my money is heating, is petrol, is gas, is things that are carbon intensive, and maybe you're spending your money on, I don't know, fine dining or pieces of art, things that are not going to be much more expensive if there's a carbon tax, right? So let's suppose, again, to keep the numbers nice and simple, that it's regressive such that you with your higher spending are going to be effectively taxed at 5%, and I'll be effectively taxed at 10%. Someone tell me, so 5%, if you spend 10K a month and you're taxed at 5%, how much are you going to be spending a month? I know someone can do this. 5% of 10K is 500. If I'm spending 1,000 and 10%, this is a little easier, then how much am I going to be spending? 100. Right. So effectively, you'll be taxed 500. Effectively, I'll be taxed 100 on this. Okay. So that's 600 in total. Now, suppose further that we divided this up in what economists sometimes call a lump sum or equal per capita, and we just rebated it, meaning we took this 600 euros and we just divided it amongst the two of us. Well, each of us would get half of 600, which is 300, right? So each of us would get 300 back if we were just taking the money, the governmental money, and just dividing it up. With me so far? Okay. So what does that mean? Well, that means that you'd end up down because you'd spend 500 and get 300 back, and I'd end up up. I'd spend 100, but I'd get 300 back. So effectively, this would be a transfer of 200 going through the government from you to me every month. Okay, so what is the point here? The point here is that with these very different spending levels, and even with a regressive carbon tax, if it's divided up evenly, it still ends up a progressive net result. Right? This is a progressive result. We're transferring money from those who are wealthier or those who are making more to those who are making less. So the point here is that when we're thinking about this, it's important to see that even if we assume that it's regressive and we assumed that we weren't rebating it in any way that's sensitive to who's wealthy, it still can end up progressive as a net effect. Okay? So that's something that I can say and you can hear it, but I think it's a little bit more powerful when you just sort of get a numerical example that gives you some idea of how this could actually work. Now, that's not how most carbon prices work, right? Obviously, they're much more complicated, but this just gives you that idea that it doesn't have to be regressive if we rebate it. So I wrote this up in an article. I discussed many aspects of carbon pricing ethics, but one of the things I wanted to do was to give a concrete example because when I was giving these kinds of talks, people would be unclear. They wouldn't be convinced until I'd given them a numerical example. Okay, so the last family of research that I'm going to discuss today, I actually do other areas, but I just didn't have time to discuss them all, is about civilizational collapse. So I'm part of a team that got what's called a SSHRC, the Social Sciences Humanity Research Council, which is the Canadian governmental grant. So we got a grant, a 5-year grant to look at climate change and civilizational collapse. And so we're discussing some of the ethical and practical and theoretical issues that arise out of this. So we're a team of, I don't know, about 10-ish people covering many different disciplines, mostly in Canada and a few in the States and of course in Ireland. So this has just started. This year is the first year of this, but hopefully this 5 years will involve a lot of discussions of the ethics of climate civilization collapse. And so our working definition for civilization collapse is that civilization collapses or society collapses when the state lacks the capacity to enact any conception of a just society. So not necessarily the correct conception, but it has enough power to make something that could be just, or in particular, to enact a particular conception of justice. So in other words, we might say that it collapses when it doesn't have the coordinating and convening capacity to get people to act in some sort of coordinated manner. Now, again, we're trying to be agnostic on a bunch of things. So we're not trying to associate civilization with Western civilization, right? This is a just society doesn't have to look anything like what we have in the West. It also doesn't require that existing societies actually enact just conceptions of society, right? It just has the capacity to, not that they actually manage to, or even that they know what a just society would look like. And we think that this is the sort of deep explanatory basis of what civilization collapse would be, as opposed to, for example, many discussions of civilizational collapse in the literature talk about archaeology and how we would detect that a civilization has fallen. But we're not interested in that. We're interested in what it is for the civilization to be collapsed. So we think that there's a bunch of interesting theoretical things that we can draw out of this. So one is that we think that although we usually think of collapse as a global thing where climate change has massive effects and it undermines civilization, we think that it's actually really important that it can be much more local, and that local collapses can happen because of various kinds of regional stressors, and that's something that's not sufficiently recognized usually. And we're also interested, although we're at the very early stages, of trying to see how those local and global collapses might interact, how one might lead to the other, and some of the mechanisms where that might happen. And the moral thing that we want to say is that if it's the case that this is realistic, then there's a precautionary case for reducing emissions. And I'll give you the logic for this. In the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, there's these various scenarios. And so there are four-ish main scenarios. And in the two sort of most polluting scenarios, RCP 8.5 and RCP 6, we have within the 66% probability interval, by the end of 2100, that those are compatible with 4 degrees warming. So meaning that by 2100, in 2 of the scenarios, these are not sort of equally likely scenarios, but 2 of the bad scenarios, we could be looking at 4 degrees of warming. And there are various different scientists and academics which have suggested, this is not known, but have suggested that 4 degrees might be incompatible with large-scale civilization. That's a strong claim. It requires extraordinary evidence, which we don't have, but it's something that reasonable people have suggested is plausible. If that's the case, then again, putting these together, it's reasonable to believe that it's possible that by the end of this century, we would be looking at temperatures that are incompatible with society. Now, again, the mechanisms need to be spelled out, the evidence needs to be adduced, but at least at first blush, this is a reasonable conclusion to draw. And if so, people that are currently alive that could live to 2100 or close to there, so very, very young people today, or the next generation, are people that potentially could face this kind of really, really bad outcome. Now, again, I want to emphasize, this is not the most likely outcome. This is not something that we should think the balance of the probabilities is on. It's compatible with our current understanding of 2 possible trajectories. That's the sort of way you should think about that. And with that in mind, we think that given that those kinds of outcomes are so bad, not only are they bad in the general sense that, of course, civilization collapse we would think is bad, but we think it's morally bad because if they collapse in this sense, if they can't enact a conception of justice, then it undermines all the potential ways of being just in those contexts. And we think that this is really important and under-recognized, because if it's the case, then talking about what policies would be good to have in 2100 presumes that we have the governments that can enact those policies. And so these preconceptions or assumptions or preconditions are sort of at least put under pressure by this, or at least not guaranteed. And so we think that that licenses a certain kind of precautionary reasoning, and that kind of precautionary reasoning is certain kinds of irreversible, very bad outcomes, if they can be, if their likelihood can be reduced at reasonable cost, that justifies doing so. That's the standard precautionary reasoning. So I'll stop there, but just to finish off, that sort of idea has the first outcome of this project. As I said, this project started this year, 2022. The first outcome is a recent opinion in PNAS, where we discuss some of the basic ideas and our sort of framework for this. And hopefully in the next few years, already there are sort of 3 papers we're drafting now that look at things from the mechanisms to the ethic, the precautionary ethics. We'll be working on many other issues on this in the future. So that's an introduction to a few streams of the research that I'm working on. Thanks so much for coming, and I look forward to your questions.
Shall I go now?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Thanks, Kian. That was good. Last one, your last topic. Might it not follow from your, what I think is pretty liberal definition of civilizational collapse, especially when we allow that it can be local, is it not plausible to think that some countries or regions have already experienced it, right? So, I mean, if we, especially when we actually take into account facts about the future, that it's already too late to change. So here come at least 2 billion new Africans. They're a fact. They're not here yet, but their grandmothers are born. So, you know, we can make some pretty good demographic, we can make very, very firm demographic predictions. We already have societies, African societies, that arguably it's already beyond them to be able to implement measures that will prevent very, very serious climate change effects, no matter what we achieve, with any reasonable target, any feasible target that now it remains to us. Now, obviously, those societies, we might think those societies could be helped with very energetic response from the rest of the world. But your definition seems to suggest that if it's not within the capacity of those governments themselves to take measures now that would allow them to have coordinating and convening power, then they've experienced civilizational collapse. I would argue that we have such cases now.
Thanks, Don. So this is actually really nice because this question sort of brings together the loss and damage and the civilization collapse, because the idea is there are things in the pipeline that are coming at this point without extensive intervention. Those things will occur, we can predict they'll occur, and they would put pressure on what our notion of civilization is.
I mean, bearing in mind that we already have extreme difficulties of convening and coordinating in those governments now, right?
Yes. So in my, yes, so I think you're absolutely right, that is an implication. So the main person who's running this project, Dan Steele, definitely thinks there are groups that are civilization collapse at this point. So he thinks that most low-lying, small island developing states, which will suffer loss and damage, and we can predict with very, very significant likelihood will undergo massive inundation and so forth, that those count as maybe will be collapsed or pre-collapsed or something like that. In the cases you're talking about ones who actually don't have this capacity at this point. And yes, in our view, those that don't have that capacity to enact anything that would look like any conception of a just society, if they don't have that capacity now, then yes, we would call that collapse, even in the context you're saying where with sufficient support, maybe that could be developed. But we are talking about the governments themselves. So I think you're absolutely right. That would follow from our definition, which you may or may not think is the correct implication.
I think it goes more radical than small island states, which are the standard, exactly, which get a lot of attention. I think you could argue we're there in South Africa already, that we already cannot by ourselves.
So we're thinking of the droughts and those sorts of things,
and our difficulties with coordinating already being unable to coordinate the mechanisms that would be required to realistically implement either mitigation or significant adaptation policies, right? We've already lost control of our energy, and we've already lost control of most of our transport system.
Well then, so I don't know South Africa as well as you, obviously, but if those are satisfied,
and we're the richest country in Africa.
Then yes, it would.
And we're the richest country in Africa, right? So then what does that imply about the others?
So yes, if all of those facts are, if those are facts, then yes, that's what imply. Yeah, I would suggest that that's the right implication. That, but it's a radical, it's a dramatic implication. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Kian. I have a question about, I suppose, the communication of this in an Irish context, and I just want to maybe give an example and see if you've encountered this. I'm thinking about your 3 pillars of climate change and especially mitigation and adaptation. And I'm just thinking about, do you know there's cases where you can present that to people very directly and they can get it, but there's kind of an emotional reaction to, like, I just don't want to be taxed, which I'm sure you come across a lot. But the specific kind of example that I want to give is, so at a very local level, I'm thinking the Dingle Peninsula, there was a community planning, so it's an organization called Northeast West Kerry District, UKD. They did these kind of town halls where they basically presented the community with demographics about, this is the population of the peninsula, this is the population of your area of the peninsula, this is the average age, so it's going into like rural isolation and people who are retired and, children leaving in local, rural isolation, and then emissions based on that. So are people traveling long distances for work? What's what are their emissions like? So they basically did a first stage meeting where they presented all this information, and then they were like, over to you, like discuss this as a community, and we'll come back to you in a month and tell us what you think. So we had a bigger one afterwards, and this happened in about 8 different places on the peninsula. And one of the most vocal people in the second meeting said, basically kind of resorted to the, Ireland, look at India and America, Ireland is nothing compared to those people, so why should we be changing our standard of living when they're like the biggest polluters in the world? And it wasn't a very considered response, but you could see it was kind of maybe representative of a gut reaction that people would have to like, why do we have to change stuff over here? But just the specific thing I wanted to give and see if you've encountered this is, again, I think most people would accept the definitions of the mitigation and adaptation. But what about cases where the ability to, or the need to adapt or the need to mitigate has been happening over such a long time that it's like generationally invisible at this point? And again, examples of this is in Ireland. People come to places like Dingle and they look at the landscape and go, oh, this is beautiful, and they think it's amazing. And then you remind them that there used to be an old thing you'd be told in school that hundreds of years ago, a squirrel could get from like Cork to Belfast and never touch the ground because it was like 95% forested. So you go, okay, it looks beautiful, but it's like that plantation over there is like 30 years old and it's just going to get cut down for firewood. And and like, again, rural stories you hear. One of the hangovers of the famine was that people who were emigrating, who had no money, who were about to get on a ship and not know if they were going to like make it to England or America, one of the last things they did, one of the last resources they would have to raise any money if they were being like kicked after land or they had to leave, is they would chop down all the trees on their land and sell it for firewood and then leave. So you have this like generational memory of, oh yeah, wood is something you get rid of. You do deforest. It's like, it's in your benefits. I'm just thinking of like examples that are hard to identify because they've been in a culture's history for so long that they've kind of become invisible. And then how do you kind of make that visible to people and communicate it in a way where you don't just get the gut reaction of like, no, this is punitive or this is unjust.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. So I think that's actually right. So there's a few points there. So one is, if we're talking about how punitive this is to a particular group that is emitting, I think that the what I call the proportional responsibility. Yeah, the proportional responsibility helps there somewhat. So the idea that yes, other people are emitting, as long as the idea is not that you emit as long as they're emitting, it's how much did each group emit, and if the responsibility is proportional, as I would argue it should be, then it's not an excuse to say other people are emitting. The question is how much are you contributing to a problem? And I think there's a deep fairness to that, and it's not going to work to say I'm not going to stop until other people have stopped. But this, I think, addresses that to some extent. But the other point you mentioned, I think, is really interesting, which is so there's various contexts. Shifting baseline syndrome is one of the terms we use, right? So shifting baseline syndrome is the idea that the environmental context we take to be normal is the one that we sort of grew up with or we're used to, but that baseline shifts, and as environments degrade, let's say, that what you think of as normal, and then you make it a little worse, and then what the next generation thinks is normal, and then a little worse, you might not notice that there's a massive change over multiple generations, which is, I think, the kind of invisibility you're interested in.
Yeah.
And that's a really hard practical challenge, and it's really hard, and that's why climate change is really a problem of timescales. It's really difficult to understand the impacts because they're extended over time and space. It's also difficult to see the causes because, as you suggest, some of them are extended over time and space. So I don't have anything particularly new or clever to say about that, although it's definitely a real problem. And then the last thing to say is, you mentioned that certain groups might have greater needs or capacities, right? So they might be well placed to mitigate, or they might be well placed to adapt, or maybe it's difficult for them to mitigate because there are distances involved and they have to drive or something. So here, what I'm focusing on is how these climatic problems come to be an issue. There might be exculpatory circumstances, mitigating circumstances that you might be able to justify whether you contribute. But that would be something you would add on, in my view, to this frame. You sort of add it on extra. You'd say, okay, yes, we caused this, we're morally responsible. There might be excuses or good reasons, and those come in after in sort of justifying it. But at first blush, we just talk about how the problems came to be, or at least I think it's simpler if we just talk about how the problems came to be. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
I am a bit unclear about your carbon pricing argument. So you have spent some time discussing its fairness, but for me the more fundamental question also ethically is whether it works. So I understand that official reason for carbon pricing is mitigation, is to reduce the amount of COW being burnt out. Is there a good evidence for it working or not working? And if it's not, I suppose the second question is, could that carbon tax be used in other ways, like adaptation, spending that money to build those walls to protect Cork City? Again, it's an empirical question this time, is the money being directed that way? And, therefore, is the whole enterprise justifiable?
Yeah, thanks, Archie. So yes, I didn't discuss those, and those are important points. So the first one is, what is the evidence of whether carbon prices work? And the second is, what do we do with the revenues, and are we using, are there more effective ways to be using them? So on the first question, do carbon prices work? The evidence is very limited and not especially positive, but it's very noisy because existing carbon prices are very low. So they don't give us much signal, certainly at the macroeconomic level. They're really, really, really small. So I would say that that's the general view of the literature. However, it's more complicated than that, in that some particular carbon pricing projects have been quite successful. So British Columbia's carbon tax, there's quite a bit of evidence that it was both effective in shifting a trajectory of emissions. It was not negative in terms of the macroeconomy of British Columbia compared to other provinces. So it didn't shift, say, production to other provinces and so forth. And it had some ancillary benefits. And one of those was that in British Columbia, they used the revenues to reduce other taxes, especially income taxes. And so that had some very positive labor benefits. It incentivized working and so forth. So as a result, British Columbia is quite low tax compared to other provinces, and it seemed to get the green benefits as well. So there are some isolated examples which have really good, it seemed to have really good evidence, and then there are much more complicated things. So Australia had a great policy of a carbon tax, but as you may know, it was repealed. So we didn't really see what it would have done. It looked like it was working for the very short period it was in play. It probably would have worked well if it had continued. We don't know. In France, as we might know, there was the yellow vest pushback. That policy was regressive. It didn't do a good job of using that revenue, or at least explaining how they were going to use that revenue. And so that was at least politically difficult, and practically speaking, it's hard to say. And then many other of the carbon pricing initiatives around the world have been cap and trade. They've had really small carbon prices. So again, the data is really noisy and not very positive. So I would say that the evidence is definitely mixed, but you're absolutely right. We should be attendant to the evidence. I just think that it's sort of hard to tell because these carbon prices tend to be small. So it's sort of hard to really judge anything on that evidence, unfortunately. We do know that pricing on other kinds of Pigouvian contexts have been really good. So making cigarettes more expensive causes people to smoke less cigarettes. That's really well established. There's many different markets, and it's sort of overwhelmingly part of the literature. And so structurally, it has a similar justification. So at least in theory, it should be straightforward to say, yes, we have evidence in other areas. I'm sure Don knows of many others where Pigouvian taxes have worked. So it should work in this realm. But as specific to this realm, the evidence is limited and noisy. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, Pigouvian taxes, it should usually be your core part of your policy, right? And then you have to supplement it with all sorts of other stuff. A Pigouvian tax alone will typically also have a bunch of unintended consequences. So you don't just roll it out and think you're sorted. But a policy mix that's trying to make significant structural level behavior change that does not include a Pagovian tax is almost sure to fail.
So that's the first part of your question, that the evidence in this area is limited and noisy, but analogous policies in other areas have pretty strong, robust evidence, I would say. The second thing, oh yeah, please.
I can argue about sick
Please,
rights,
yeah.
actually. And I missed the whole thing. I'm really sorry, I was in the wrong place. Despite the nicotine being very addictive, so it is a market because of its addictive nature. It's not a necessity like all the things that come in carbon. Our life, our social system are based on carbon. So I suppose how transferable is those kind of analogies? Because I use the smoking ban as an analogy for some of the stuff I'm looking at, but it don't fit completely.
Yeah, so no, I didn't talk about it in the presentation, but I'm happy to. Thanks for that. Yeah, so the suggestion is, well, there's an important disanalogy between the smoking case and the carbon case, which is that carbon is part of our lifestyles in an integral way, or something, an intrinsic way, a deep way that's hard to manipulate. So to some extent, that's certainly the case. So there's no lifestyle in the developed world where you could not emit any emissions, but there are ways you can substitute for slightly more green modes of transportation, green modes of heating for slightly browner ones, if there is the right incentive, or at least that's the standard response. So what you'd say is, look, yes, it's true that all of the things we do, embody carbon, use carbon, emit carbon, but there are ways of there are alternatives to all these things, and those alternatives are getting better. And in particular, in terms of dynamic pricing, the expectation that they'll be more expensive to be brown will lead us to innovate and develop more of those alternatives. That's part of the motivation. Even if at this time we don't have clear alternatives, those alternatives will be developed if there is a market that gives that market signal. That's the standard way. So just to give you a concrete example, here in Ireland, we eat a lot of meat, and meat is very energy and emission intensive. But the products that are meat replacements are getting better all the time. And part of that is the market signal that there is expectation that people will go for things that are at least close to as good if they are greener, and there is a price. Don is nodding at me and given that this is part of his area, great. So there's a second part of your question, which I didn't get to, which is the revenue. Could it be used more effectively? And the answer there is that that's an empirical question. Obviously, it might vary somewhat from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Politically speaking, there is robust evidence that there are some things that using carbon revenue is good for policy and acceptability, and things that it's not. So we couldn't just use it for education and say education is a thing that needs more resources, because people say, okay, well, I'm giving this money and it's going to something totally different, but that just doesn't compute, even if that is the effective thing to do with the revenue, let's suppose. So usually there are sort of two main buckets, and one of them is environmental things, so making it easier to be green with the resources from carbon taxes. So that could be transportation, increasing bus capacity and so forth, and cycling lanes and so forth. And then the other thing is these kinds of rebates. And these rebates, there is, again, mixed evidence, but in the British Columbian case, that seemed to be a large part of what made that policy stick in that case, and what made it not stick in the yellow vest France case. So again, the evidence is somewhat unclear, but those two sort of sets of uses of revenue seem to be really important for political acceptability. But you're right, they might not be the most effective uses of those resources, in which case that we might have to sacrifice some efficiency for making the policy, for example. Although this is a live area of research, which I am not an expert in, but this is a live area of research, and there's a lot of really good work done on that.
So switching over to the civilizational collapse, which of course is a dramatic concept, but I was struck by how state-centered your depiction was. And I get that everything else you do involves state as the primary agent of these things. But when I think of civilization, and even you switched to the adjective societal collapse, what about the social cultural dimension of collapse or lack of collapse And then kind of counterbalancing that, global capitalism doesn't seem to appear. I mean, to say, oh, there's this tiny little country somewhere remote in the world, and it's at risk of collapse. And yet multinational corporations are doing business there. So how can we just look at them ethnographically and say, oh, look, they're going to collapse, when in fact, in other words, I'm squeezing in on the state both from the side that actually the world is run by capital at this point, and then also squeezing in it from the other side, which is that if states collapsed, society might still have something.
Yeah, thanks, Roy. So those are good questions. So on the first one, what about the social and cultural implications of collapse? So the short answer is we don't have any ideas about that. That's why I didn't discuss it. But that's not to say it's not important. It obviously is. And that's something that other people have commented on this work as well. And so we are hoping to think about what we could say about that, if there are things we could contribute to that. Our view is that that's downstream. So the idea is that the civilization collapsed and there might be a lot of effects, and some of those will be kinds of intangible loss that are hard. We don't think that that's what's core to the collapse. Maybe that's what you're objecting to. You're saying that the core is the loss of the cultural structure or something. Is that the suggestion?
I mean, to say that the structure of society has collapsed, that's not necessarily a state question to jump straight to. A state has these capabilities isn't really the...
Well, one thing to say, and I see Don wants to come in, but one thing to say is that, how are we doing? We're good. Okay. One thing to say is that when we're talking about the different kinds of collapse, we're not committed to the idea that it has to have a robust state in any sort of sense. So an anarchical society could have a sense, a conception of justice in our sense. So it doesn't have to be some sort of, with an army and a navy and so forth. But I think you're saying something even stronger, which is maybe the sense of it being a society or being a civilization is in its cultural DNA, in which case I don't have a strong view on that. You want to come in?
I think your better move there is to just say, remember, we're trying to keep our focus on climate change effects and not talk about everything anyone could think of, right? So, the way I think an original question to you is relevant here. The reason I think it's appropriate to say that we're in a collapsed state already in South Africa is by just appeal to facts like this. Not because this is supposed to imply we're on the road to a Mad Max world, but rather I just say a fact like the following one. We're now boiling our kettles in the morning using diesel generators, right? Because our electricity transmission system has collapsed. Now at that point, you're on a disaster. You're in the abyss from a climate change point of view, right? And it's the state's inability to coordinate the repair of the electricity grid that leaves us no obvious way to look forward to a point where we're not heating our kettles with diesel generators. Because once everybody's got a diesel generator, you're in a disastrous place from a climate change point of view, right? And that's, I would call collapse, because you've reached in the reverse a place where your continuing descent is irreversible without some kind of external assistance. Right, without exogenous institutional intervention. I'm gonna go teach. So
Yeah. But we probably should stop.
Yeah. So I'm going to suggest, just because it is nearly 2 and people probably have other commitments at 2 o'clock, that if there's.
I was just wondering, what about people who wouldn't be able to pay for things with a carbon tax, or if your lifestyle kind of clashed with it, like you were addicted to smoking or something like that. Do you think if there's something that ethically, I don't know if that's the word, is good for the climate, but then it clashes with something that would be ethical in society, how would we get?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So that's where I think that those rebates potentially are valuable, because if it's the case that you are in the, let's say, lower 60% of society, if we had this kind of structure, then that would offset any regressivity. It would actually make it on net cheaper for you if you're poor. And so that means that I actually think, again, if we set the policy right, then that isn't a problem, or we can address that as a potential problem, and then there isn't that conflict. But I agree, if there is that conflict, then that's really hard, and I don't know necessarily which one has to win.
I'm always hesitant to interrupt when we get a good discussion at the end of these things, but there's tea and coffee and sandwiches over there, even if you just want to migrate the discussion that way, so that you can have some refreshments while you do so. Thank you very much, Kian. I think that was a lovely way to round off our series for the year, and thank you again for coming along and for your questions.
Thanks so much, Ray. Thank you. Sorry.
Well, a lot of different topics, but